Hey guys, it's Mr. Stratton. Today I want to talk to you about AP Biology topic 1.1, water and hydrogen bonding. Now you'll notice in that picture on the side there that the droplet of water sitting on top of that surface is clinging to itself, but it's not really liking touching that surface there. So what we're going to talk about today is the fact that water molecules are really cohesive. They really like to stick to each other. And sometimes they like to stick to other things. So, essential questions: how does the structure of a water molecule influence the properties of water? That's a big thing in AP biology, is structure and function. How do those two things go together? And then, how do the properties of water affect living organisms? So, we're going to take the structure, we're going to move on from there to the properties based on that structure, and then based on those properties, how does that affect living things? So water molecules are actually, of course, H2O, which is made of one oxygen bonded to two hydrogen atoms. You remember from chemistry. And water is polar. The reason it's polar is because the oxygen atom is much more electronegative than the hydrogen atoms. Now, electronegativity, I know it sounds complicated, but it really is exactly what it says. That atom is more negative because the electrons like to hang out there more. Has to do with the whole thing of how many electrons it has versus the protons and the shells, and we're not going to go into all that in this class. But the thing you need to remember, though, is that the oxygen has the electrons the majority of the time, and therefore it's going to be slightly negatively charged, and the hydrogen ends are going to be slightly positively charged. So when those electrons cluster around the oxygen, they give it a slight negative charge, like I said, and a slight positive charge on the hydrogen ends. All right, so what does that do for the properties of water? Well, because water is polar, it means that the water molecules will actually attract to the opposite pole on another water molecule. In this case, they're going to form something called a hydrogen bond. And water is great at forming hydrogen bonds, both with itself and with other molecules. So those hydrogen bonds, when they form, that helps something to dissolve in water. Okay, so you'll notice right there that the oxygens are attracted to the hydrogens of a separate water molecule. Now, a thing to take note of is that those are drawn as dotted lines because they're not truly bonds, not in the sense of like a covalent bond where there's electrons being shared, but there's just a slight attraction there. They're strong, but at the same time they're weak. So that polarity leads to all the other properties of water. So I told you that when hydrogen bonds are formed with other things, like when those negatives attract to other positives and vice versa, then you get something dissolving in water. So water is what's called the universal solvent. It dissolves most organic molecules, and in our bodies we're made up majority water, and so the idea is that in our blood and everywhere in our bodies we have water molecules. So a little bit of terminology. Hydrophilic means literally water loving. So things that dissolve in water are hydrophilic. Things that don't dissolve in water are called hydrophobic or water fearing. And so that would be things like lipids and some proteins that can't dissolve. Also, some molecules, once they get really, really large, then they stop being able to dissolve in water as well, just simply because the hydrogen bonds can't suspend that huge of a molecule. Something like starch, for example, doesn't dissolve very well. Okay, so like I said before, it allows for transport in our blood, our circulatory system, right? Our bodies being made up of a lot of water. Okay, water also has what's called a high heat capacity and a high heat of vaporization. What that means is it takes a lot of energy there in those bonds between the hydrogen bonds, between the water molecules. So when water evaporates, when it turns from a liquid to a gas, it actually absorbs a significant amount of energy from its surroundings. So energy comes in, and it breaks that hydrogen bond and allows that water molecule to escape. Now think about boiling water on your stove. You've got the heat underneath, and as those hydrogen bonds break, then the water evaporates and turns to a gas. That's the steam. Now on the flip side of things, when water condenses, it releases energy. So if you've got water boiling on the stove and it's coming off as gas, do not stick your hand in the steam because you can get severely burned by that little burst of energy coming off as that hydrogen bond forms. Okay, now what does this mean? It means that evaporation helps to cool things down, and condensation actually can warm things up. So if you go someplace down near the beach, like for example Long Beach, you're going to find that it has pretty stable climate all year round. Even when it's 100 degrees in the desert, it's maybe in the 70s or possibly the low 80s down by the beach. And the same token, if you go to the winter time, it snows occasionally in Las Vegas, but it never snows down by the beach. I mean, not here. It's always relatively stable climate, which is why people like to live there. So, Long Beach may get down into possibly the high 50s, low 60s. It gets up into maybe the 80s at the hottest, and that's pretty much their range. If you go to Vegas, it can be really cold and it can be really hot. And it's simply because whether or not there's water there to absorb the heat. And when it absorbs the heat, the water is going to evaporate. And of course, when water condenses and turns into fog or clouds, then that releases that heat back out. So places near bodies of water have very stable climates, which is why we like to live in those types of areas. All right. Oops. So water has cohesive and adhesive properties. So water likes to stick to itself. So that's what we call cohesion, and that would cause what's known as surface tension. So in that picture right there, you've got a water strider, and it's actually standing on the hydrogen bonds in that water. If we were in school right now, I would actually do a stupid teacher trick, and I would demo this with a paper clip. I can float it on water. Now, adhesion is when water sticks to other things. And this is what allows water to be transported up trees. So the water is not only forming a conga line of water molecules sticking to itself, but it's also sticking to the inside of the plant's veins, right? Its xylem, and that allows it then to be transported up the tree. And now there's a limitation on how tall a tree can get, simply because the strength of the hydrogen bond only allows, against the pull of gravity, the tree can only get so tall. And in fact, redwood trees, they actually drink from the fog in the air from their leaves. So they're pretty tall, and they actually maybe exceed the height of what a plant could normally do. All right, so what does this look like for us? Well, if you've ever done a belly flop, you've been exposed to hydrogen bonds. So can you imagine how terrifying it would be if all of a sudden hydrogen bonds were 2 times stronger and you went swimming? You're like swimming in jello. So another property of water is that it's less dense as a solid than a liquid. So, which is really weird if you think about it. For something to become a solid, its molecules have to get closer together, ideally. Now with water, what happens is there's actually a crystal structure that forms, and so it's actually less dense if you look at that picture there. And the result is that ice floats in water. Now, what that means for living organisms is that lakes and ponds don't freeze completely in the wintertime. The ice forms on the surface and floats there, and then it insulates the water below and keeps it liquid, allows things to survive. Okay, so what do I want you to do with this? Well, first off, let's talk structure, right? So find 4 water molecules and diagram them bonding together with hydrogen bonds. Label the covalent bonds between the hydrogens and oxygens, the hydrogen bonds between water molecules, and then the positive and negative charges on those molecules. Okay. Here's a graph that's showing you something about water. So I want you to write a title. Well, first, I guess you should interpret this graph and explain how it reflects the properties of water, and then write a title for this graph. Explain how this diagram is related to the properties of water. And finally, describe the role of hydrogen bonding in the transport of water in plants, and the properties and role of water in maintaining homeostatic control of your body temperature. So I didn't talk specifically about body temperature, but I think you can probably infer that from looking back when I was talking about effects on climate. Okay? So looking back at this then, we talked about structure and properties of water and how they were related, and then how the properties of water affected living organisms. So thank you very much for watching.